Welcome to this mini lecture about the external carotid artery. Please excuse my voice at the moment. So, the external carotid artery is a branch of the common carotid artery, which splits off around C345, around C34, and gives the external carotid, which supplies mainly the face, and then the internal carotid, which isn't shown here, but it supplies only within the skull. It doesn't have any branches outside the skull. So we'll be talking about the external carotid artery here, and a good way to remember all of its branches is through the phrase some anatomists like freaking out poor medical students. So the first letter of all of those words will give the branches of the external carotid artery. So we'll begin first with the first branch, which is the superior thyroid. We won't go into too much detail regarding all these smaller branches, but essentially it supplies the thyroid gland, which sits over here. These small branches are just different arteries that supply different parts of the gland, such as the cricothyroid branch, the posterior and the anterior. But that's essentially what the superior thyroid artery supplies. The next branch is the ascending pharyngeal artery, which can be located as it is ascending, like this one, which is in the name. So the ascending pharyngeal artery essentially supplies the pharynx and the soft palate. We can trace it here. As I said, we won't go into the little branches of it, but it essentially supplies the soft palate and the pharynx. So these are all small branches of it. Let's move on. So that was the ascending pharyngeal. The next one is the lingual artery, which the etymology of lingual is tongue, means tongue. So you can assume that the lingual artery supplies the tongue. This is the lingual artery here. It comes off on the anterior part of the external carotid artery and works to supply the tongue. This is the deep lingual artery, which supplies purely the tongue. And this is the sublingual. Sublingual means underneath, below the tongue. This supplies the sublingual gland, which sits just about there and produces saliva and releases it into the oral cavity. So that's the lingual artery. Supplies mainly the tongue and the sublingual gland. It also has smaller branches over here, which also supplies some of the soft palate and the tonsils, but we won't go into that. So that's the lingual artery. The next one is the facial artery. The facial artery is one of the main arteries of the face. It is quite tortuous in structure and shape. It winds on the side of the face. And if you put your finger around halfway down the mandible, the body of the mandible, you can actually feel a pulse here. So if you can palpate that, that would be really good for your learning. But you can appreciate the tortuousness of the facial artery. The facial artery supplies most of the face. We can see it supplies all of the structures that run across here. But we'll begin with some of the branches that you can't see from this end. We'll start off with the first branch it gives off, which is the ascending palatine artery. The ascending palatine artery supplies mainly the soft palate, and we can see it from this side as it runs over there. This is the soft palate here, and that's the hard palate there forward. Soft palate from here backwards, and that's where the ascending palatine artery emerges from. So that's the first branch. The second branch is the submental artery, which submental means below the chin. Mental means chin. So it runs along the inferior border of the mandible and works to supply the submandibular gland, which is another one of the main salivary glands that empties into the mouth. It supplies it with these branches, the glandular branches. They come off either the submental artery or off the facial artery itself. So the submental artery traverses the inferior border of the mandible and comes forward to supply some part of the front part of the mandible, just next to the chin. So that's the submental artery. It also supplies some of the muscles underneath the mandible, such as the digastric, genioglossus, hyoglossus, mylohyoid, and platysma. Platysma is a very superficial muscle that runs along the anterior border of the neck, or the anterior neck. But yeah, that's the submental artery. That's the next branch of the facial artery that we're going to learn. So, and then the next parts of the facial artery, if you have a look from here, they can be seen on the anterior part of the face. So as you can see, this is the facial artery. It supplies the superior lip and the superior labial artery. Labial means lip. And the inferior labial artery. So upper lip and lower lip is what the facial artery supplies. The final parts of the facial artery supply the nose, or the external part of the nose, such as this, the nasal septal branch that supplies part of the septum. And then you've got the lateral nasal branch and the angular artery. They all supply the lateral part, the extrinsic part of the nose, lateral skin on the nose. So that's the facial artery completed. That's all we're going to go through for the facial artery. The next artery is the occipital artery. The occipital artery, as the name suggests, runs towards the occipital bone. But before it does that, it gives a branch to the sternocleidomastoid, which is a muscle that turns the head. So lower and upper parts of the sternocleidomastoid are supplied by the occipital artery. And then the occipital artery continues behind the mastoid process, which is just this, and continues to run to the occipital bone, which is here, and supplies the back part of the head. So just know for the occipital artery that it supplies sternocleidomastoid and the posterior part of the head. The next artery is posterior auricular. As the name suggests, posterior auricular means behind the ear. So the ear is located just here, and the posterior auricular artery supplies the middle and external ear, some muscles of the neck, and the facial nerve. And the facial nerve, we'll have another video about that, but the posterior auricular artery essentially supplies the structures behind the ear, which is just over here. The next branch is the maxillary artery. The maxillary artery is one of the main, another one of the main arteries of the face. More deeper structures this one supplies, but we'll make a separate video on the maxillary artery because it has quite a number of branches that we have to talk about, and is especially relevant for dentistry. So that's the maxillary artery. The final part of the external carotid artery is the superficial temporal artery. Some may say that this is the termination of the external carotid artery, since it continues off the external carotid artery. But essentially, you can see the extent that it supplies. It's quite a big artery. It supplies all of this region, as well as this part here. So we'll go through its branches now. It has a few branches, but the main part about this artery is that it supplies the parotid gland. So just this branch here, sometimes it comes off the transverse facial artery, which is a branch of the superficial temporal artery, supplies the parotid gland. This is of particular importance as it actually goes through it along with the retromandibular vein and the facial nerve. So it's one of the three structures that pierces through the parotid gland and supplies it. So as we mentioned, this is the transverse facial artery, and the next branch is the zygomatica orbital artery. Now, a good way to remember these branches is to remember them in pairs. So the transverse facial artery is this one. Zygomatica orbital artery is this one. They are about equidistant to the zygomatic arch of the temporal bone, which is just here. So if you think about this one, this goes from the zygomatic arch, roughly here, towards the orbit. That's why it's called the zygomatica orbital artery. It works to supply the orbicularis oculi muscle, which is the muscle around the orbit, around the eye. So that's the transverse facial, and that's the zygomatica orbital artery. So those are the two important arteries there. The next branch of the superficial temporal artery is this one, This is the middle temporal artery. Now, if you've already watched the maxillary artery video, you'll know that there are a couple branches from the maxillary artery that supply the temporalis muscle. They are this one, the posterior deep temporal, and the anterior deep temporal. Now, these both supply the lower parts of the temporalis muscle, whereas this part supplies the upper part of the temporalis muscle. That's why it's called the middle temporal artery. It also supplies, so it supplies the temporalis muscle. Now, the final part of the superficial temporal artery is a termination of it, and you can see them here. This, which is the parietal branch, and this, which is the frontal branch. These are named based on their location. So this supplies the skin above the frontal bone, and this supplies the skin over the temporal bone and the parietal bone. That's why it's called the parietal branch. And you can see the extent that it supplies. And you can sometimes see these arteries. If you're at the gym and you're lifting a heavy weight, sometimes they begin to pulsate because they are very superficial, given the name superficial temporal. And so that's the superficial temporal artery. That's about it for the external carotid artery, where I'm going to make another video on the maxillary artery, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for listening.